And it always takes a second to start. And we're back with the Dr. Z show. We have another guest host with us, but I'm Anthony.
And I'm Jacob. And our guest today is Dr. Irene Greenman.
Hello, hello.
So,
Welcome to the show.
As we do, we're going to fire off some introductory questions and sort of give the rest of the nerds a feel for who you are without too many of the invasive details.
Okay.
So, Irene, what is a useless skill that you have?
That I can piece together a Roman person's biography from their tombstone. Which is useful in pretty much
in
no way.
very specific circumstances.
Yeah.
That is very legit.
Jacob's impressed.
Yeah, I for the sake of time, I won't ask further details on that, but I wish I
want
could.
Later on, if you want details, I'll give them to you if you want.
So what is something that bothers you that doesn't seem to bother anyone else?
Probably autocorrect turning back on when I have turned it off.
That happens to me occasionally.
It happens to any computer
and network. Me.
Okay, so it does bother other people.
Well,
okay. I never know what bothers other people.
Maybe not autocorrect, but predictive text like overrides autocorrect sometimes for me. And it usually happens when I update my phone and I text my fiance something, or I text in worse situations, I text my mother, or even worse, my fiance's mother something, and it suddenly becomes very horrible. Trying to backpedal from that is a skill that I use too often.
Yeah, it's predictive text is a blessing and a curse. What is
autocorrect?
What's something that
in a different language? Sorry. Go ahead.
What's something that you like that everyone else seems to dislike?
I'm gonna go with Jaime Lannister. He has been my favorite character in A Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones since the first book. And people who are otherwise very reasonable at discussing books and things like that with me will look at me and say, "You're a horrible person," when I tell them that he's my favorite character.
Is it weird that I can kind of see why?
I don't think so. But then, I mean, either we're both horrible people, or, I mean, eventually people start to see why. But people who, when only say the first book was out, and so it gets to. I mean, how spoiler sensitive are we on this show for things that most people know already?
I mean, spoilers if you're gonna get into it, but okay. I mean, if you haven't by now.
I mean, you get to the end of season one / book 1, and Ned Stark comes to his tragedy. I'll just leave it there. And at that point, Jaime Lannister is my favorite character, and people stare at me and go, "What?" But he was my favorite character the moment he was introduced as both the Lion of Lannister and the Kingslayer in the same scene.
I do like his character, and he does go through a lot of very drastic changes, which sort of change his personality in major ways, but not his overarching.
Right.
I hesitate to use the word character again, but
motif.
MO. Not necessarily. He's the same person.
Yeah.
But he reacts differently because of the things that have happened to them. And that sounds very like
okay.
Duh.
He actually learns. He actually learns and grows like a real person.
Yeah, and you can watch that happen. Whereas it's very difficult to discern for someone like Sansa and otherwise, in the last 2 seasons, like the first few seasons, she was the same character, and you just there was no development there, and you just like every episode you were like, okay, when is she gonna cry this time? Because that was her character for a long time, and then suddenly she like changes, like sort of overnight, and you realize that these things have all like come to fruition and affected her. But with Jamie Lannister, you can watch that happen at a slower pace.
Yeah, and I mean, and he was my favorite character before some of those changes, but there are so many layers. He's one of the most complicated characters in the show and in the books.
Like an onion.
Yes. And yeah, that's exactly where my brain went with that. And you know, even people, I say he's my favorite character, and people stare at me and they say things like, "But he sleeps with his sister, and he tried to kill an 8-year-old."
Yeah, that's not why he's your favorite character.
That's obviously not why. That's obviously not why he's my favorite character. He's my favorite character because he's faced with this situation where there's this 8-year-old, where he does a thing that has been completely acceptable in another family, and if this 8-year-old brings back word of it, there's going to be a civil war. So what's he supposed to do? And that's such a complicated question
that I think we should sit on the back burner, possibly forever.
Probably. Yep.
Possibly forever.
Yep.
Go ahead, Jacob. There's a couple more.
What's something that you dislike that everyone else seems to like?
Oof. Steven Universe. I just
Okay.
it's too high energy for me. I couldn't. It's the kind of thing that I had to put almost sort of metaphorical sunglasses on. I couldn't. There was too much coming at me, and I had to sort of say, nope, I can't. I'm getting overstimulated by this.
I like really hate to agree again, but I agree. Like, it just I tried it. Like I just couldn't get into it. Like it just wasn't for me.
I'm waiting for the new episode. So
Sort of
It's
like a lot
clearly
of
a good
things.
show. It's clearly a good show, but it just was not for me.
Do you watch it?
yeah, I mean, I'm like, if we were to describe anyone in this group as hyper, I guess maybe I would be the one. And I love Steven Universe. So.
Well, I mean,
like I got a good night's rest last night, and this morning I was just like super hyper during my classes.
Maybe not this time, but you take what you get.
Well, it's that kind of show with that sort of hyper energy is the kind of thing that I often have trouble with. But most of them aren't that popular. But Steven Universe has exploded into popularity in general nerddom and has become much more mainstream than many of those do. And so that's one that I think qualifies for that question.
Cool. I think if my math is right, there's one more.
That's what I have.
What is an example of your real life D&D alignment?
Okay, so I think I'm generally neutral good, but with sort of chaotic neutral leanings. I work in bureaucracy. I've worked as a school teacher. You have to learn how to work within a system. You have to learn which rules you can break, which rules you can't break. At the same time, I hate those rules. They bother me. And I sometimes barricade senators' offices to get them to pass legislation protecting disabled people. So, and help run support to help people get arrested.
That seems like chaotic good
Congress.
to me.
So, I do both. There's definitely chaotic leanings, but I can't always express those.
Gotcha.
And Jacob, you described yourself as chaotic good, if I remember correctly?
Yeah, either chaotic good or neutral good.
You're definitely chaotic good. The way you play board games makes you chaotic good.
Or chaotic evil.
Well, and that's the thing. When you get into things like board games and whatnot, I have no hesitation to just betray my neighbor. So.
Okay, I know who I'm not playing Betrayal House on the Hill with.
I love that game.
It's so good. Not sponsored. by Betrayal House on the Hill or Wizards of the Coast. Unfortunately, we would make a ton of money if we were sponsored by Wizards of the Coast, let's be honest.
They're already sponsoring so many people.
I mean, they got a lot of money.
That's true.
Well, I love cooperative board games. That's one of my things. So
until you become the trader. Hey.
I mean, she might love it then if she wins.
Well, I mean, frankly, even if I don't, I love the experience. The first one I ever played was Shadows over Camelot, and my favorite character in the Arthurian legend is Mordred. So there's another example. And so I'm always very excited to play the Traitor in Shadows over Camelot, which, to give you an example of this, we have owned a copy of that game for, I want to say 9 years now, 10 years, and we've played this game hundreds of times. I have been the Traitor 3 times. It's ridiculous.
So sad.
We start looking at each other and everyone goes, well, Arena's not the Traitor. Because I never am.
We need to. I need to write this down for us to have just a podcast about board games later, where we'll have to invite every host that we know.
I'm in.
But then again, I'm that asshole. Oh, there's another one.
Swear jar.
Yeah, I got it. I'm that guy that sat down for a week and played Twilight Imperium and nothing else.
Nice.
With a group of friends, where it took us an entire day to read the rules and then 6 days to play the game.
I recommend the game Seafall if you like that kind of thing.
I'll have to look into it. All right, but we are not here to talk about board games. And with the introductions out of the way, we can get sort of into the meat of the issue. Today, we are going to talk about something more serious, but I feel that it is especially important that us as nerds and in the nerd community at the very least acknowledge this. And we're going to talk about bullying. Now, for the sake of transparency, we are going to wait until a later date, until Jacob and I, and possibly Irina, depending on if she wants to come back, are going to do some deeper research and read some articles and have some sources ready to talk about gatekeeping, toxicity, Gamergate, and what is becoming Comicsgate. We will not be talking about those today. We will talk about them at a later date, though, I promise you. But today we're just going to sort of get into kind of the basics and let everyone simmer. I'll mention this again at the end, but we would love to hear feedback from you guys, especially about this. Any experience you have with it, anything you know that we don't know or that you think we might not know, and anything sort of related that you'd like to see us talk about or discuss on the show. But the first thing we're going to talk about is sort of what makes a nerd a nerd. Like is everyone a nerd because they all have that one thing, or are there people that are nerds and then there are people that aren't nerds? What do you guys think?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that everyone does have that one thing. I mean, I think certainly a lot of people have that one thing, but not everybody. I mean, first, I think that it's easy to say for us who are nerds, that because most of the people that we know and interact with on a daily basis are going to be people who have that one thing. But some members of my family are very, very different from me and do not have that one thing.
Right, I can understand that. And sort of the first example that springs to my mind is my fiance. You know, I consider myself hardcore nerd. Like, I'm into Star Wars, I'm into video games, I'm into comic books, I'm into, fantasy books, I'm into sci-fi, I'm like, I've got my hands in so many pies, I need more hands. Like, and I am so into these things. And my fiance's kind of not. Like, she plays Magic the Gathering with me because it's something we could do together, and we play video games together. She's taken a great interest in Halo, shockingly enough. and she enjoys playing Minecraft with me. But I wouldn't consider her a nerd in that sense, like a gaming nerd. Like she shares my love of Star Wars to a point. I mean, not to the point that I have, where I'll have it tattooed on my body and license plate on my car and so on and so forth. But she does enjoy Star Wars, and so she's a little bit of a sci-fi nerd in that aspect. But I would consider her a classical music nerd because she loves classical music. To kind of to me, someone who doesn't necessarily listen to classical music very much, to kind of a worrying degree. Like the amount of records I had when I started collecting records has been, an amount, and suddenly she, shows up with 50, classical records that I've never heard of, like, any of these things, and I'm like, what is happening now? Um, but it's expanded my nerd interest. I can't say that I'm a big classical music fan now, but it's more than tolerating it.
And as someone who first was hearing the term nerd in the 80s, nerd then was being used to describe someone with a degree of expertise
Hmm.
in some kind of rare interest. So
Yeah.
expertise was part of it as well.
Yeah, and she's.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to talk about an expert in classical music, of course, experts usually do not consider themselves experts, but she plays piano and sings and does that better than most. I mean, certainly better than the common person. So I would consider her an expert by my standards, but probably not by her own.
Well, and what about professional? I mean, because there's the question.
Well, she's a
Am
musician,
I
so
well?
there's
And
that.
for example, okay, so there's that. There's the question of, for example, if she is professionally a musician or has a degree in music. I have a doctorate in Latin. Does that make me not a Latin nerd? Are all doctorates in Latin nerds by some definition? Or do you have to have an interest in something that is not your profession? What about
This
those
is,
people who manage to make it their profession?
I mean, we we have been acquainted with some of those people, and her brother. I won't get into details because I've actually not spoken to him about, being on the show, or that he might not even know that the show exists. But her brother's a professional trombone player, so that was, he's a nerd about the trombone, like, very specific.
Right. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Similarly, I won't go into detail, but I know someone who is a professional anime translator.
That's awesome.
So Jacob,
only to a point.
yeah. So
I've
Jacob,
have
you're
been thinking about is like the term nerd kind of like socially, you've got like your like the connotation and the denotation of it. Like I think when
absolutely.
people hear the word nerd, um, maybe not necessarily a hard definition, but I think sometimes it's used to describe people who are really interested in something that maybe most people are not interested in. So, for instance, like someone, I guess, could be a sports nerd, but you don't really think of that. Like, in like classic, like, I don't know, like high school or like whatever definitions of like people, like when you think of someone who's into sports, you don't really think of them as a nerd. They're like the kind of the opposite would be if they're into sports and they play sports, like you use the term jock.
Mm-hmm.
But like, by our definition of someone who is really good at something, like, but I think part of that too is that like sports is I mean, granted, like video games and other things it's a very global industry and everything. But like, there's in terms of like the numbers of people who go to sporting events to support their country, whether in like soccer or other things like that, is very different than maybe like the numbers of people who go to like a quote unquote esports event. So like I think nerddom to a degree like, not that sports is excluded from it, but like I think culturally we've kind of almost identified it as like nerdy stuff is things that are intellectual perhaps in nature that people are really into, or related to fiction, like, if that makes sense.
Yeah, getting on the other side of that, there was something, and I'll reference this, and you both might reference this a few times, but I started a what turned out to be a very long discussion on my personal Facebook about the topic we're talking today, about bullying, and a friend of mine, Jem, brought up sort of the difference in, and sort of made me realize the difference in what Jacob was talking about. In, there's nerds about video games, and there's nerds about comics, and there's nerds about TV, and there's nerds about movies, and that's typically what we talk about on the show. But a lot of the things, sort of the things that we're missing, are like the academic nerds, like the engineers and the linguists and the people that are nerds, but about like sort of pure academic pursuits, and they're a nerd in that way.
Yeah. Something that I don't want to like spiral this off into too much of a tangent, but
Shockingly.
I think part of it too is that and like Irina will have perhaps better perspective in this in terms of like the development of the term, but I feel like nerd is one of those terms that started out as like, the term like nerd or geek, something that was used in a derogatory way that has
Absolutely.
since been adopted because the people who have those interests want to be proud of it. But I think sometimes there's still like a little bit of an element of like it's sometimes hard to be proud of, not necessarily things that make you different, but like people want to fit in. And so I think sometimes like, even like, as much as I'm like, oh yeah, like I'm a nerd, and I'm like excited to use that term to identify myself with other people, to be social with them, I still kind of know that like there's people who find my interests like unsavory or terrible, I guess, is kind of like, to me there seems like there's still a little bit of an element of that when people use the term nerd.
Yeah, I 100% agree.
Yes, well, and in true nerd form, I'm staring at Wikipedia right now, and Wikipedia tells us that apparently it began in 1951 as nerd slang.
Whoa!
As student slang, and then was sort of adopted in post 1980s to just generally mean a member of a subculture, revolving in particular around video games, fantasy, science fiction, comic books, and assorted media. And certainly in the 80s, it was almost entirely, which is when I was growing up, it was almost entirely derogatory. Now it is has been much more, the term I usually hear is reclaimed. It the term nerd was practically a subculture slur in the 1980s. But even now, as a teacher, as someone who clearly identifies myself as a nerd and is interested in and teaches a subject that is quote unquote nerdy and tends to attract a lot of nerds, and I'm obviously friendly to and a member of a lot of those subcultures, it means something very different if I call my students nerds than if some other teachers do. And I would hear, for example, it meant something very different if a student came to me, for example, with broken glasses, and I said, okay, what happened? And the student would say bitterly, well, the teacher called me a nerd, the gym teacher called me a nerd just before my glasses broke. And that's all they would say. And at that point, I knew there was an incident, capital I, on our hands, because somebody saying one thing, saying the same term, me saying the term nerd to my students meant something very different.
I understand that.
That was something that happened a lot with substitute teachers in particular.
Yeah, I understand that, and I don't want to get too much into the relationship end of things on this, but I sort of for transparency's sake, I do remember being in your class and being one of those people there that was sort of the room was almost always 50-50, and there were half the people in the room were there because they were interested in the subject, and the other half the people were there because they had to fulfill their language requirement and they saw it as easy, which they were quickly told it was not. But
well, and some discovered they had a natural aptitude for, and then there was also some crossover there, I think, where there were people who were there because they had to fulfill their language requirement and they heard the teacher was nerd friendly.
Just to sort of wrap up that end of things, like it brought me great joy to have you sign my yearbook senior year, and you to ask me Jedi or Sith, and of course in my foolishness I said Sith because I didn't realize that there were others. For you to write the Sith code not only in its entirety but in Latin in red pen in my yearbook as your sort of blurb signature.
Yep. I remember that well.
So, okay, so we're nerds, and we're nerds about different things, and there can be nerds about all kinds of things. So not everyone has the one thing that they're a nerd about, or at least that they would consider themselves a nerd about. And let's sort of focus on, what people see themselves as, because that's the kind of person that they'll project. As we get into sort of the bullying. And the question that sparked all of this was, let me see if I have it exactly. Sort of in my ignorance, not really thinking this through, I said, I had never in my life seen a nerd bully a non-nerd for not being into nerd things. But my entire life, I have continued to see non-nerds bully nerds. And I said, why is this? And before everyone jumps down my throat about that, it was meant mostly in the physical sense of sort of what Jacob was saying before about like the jock kind of stereotype, like bullying the weaker, smaller kind of nerd stereotype. And that was something that I zeroed in on very quickly when I was thinking about this question, but that I didn't really realize the scope of what of all of the things that could be addressed in that question.
The rabbit holes, as we've discovered.
Yes. Yeah. And we're only going to touch sort of on the tip of that, so we can have some topics for research. But in our experience as nerds, we'll start with Jacob. What stands out to you as something that, like, something negative that has happened to you because you were a nerd? Like, someone looked down on you solely because you identified as a nerd.
So, okay, two things. I am in a kind of a weird position where, like, I, for the most part, haven't been, like, bullied in my life. Like, I've been stressed out about expressing opinions that were contrary to others, but for the most part, I haven't been, like, bullied. Like, never physically, like, not really, like, like, intellectually, like, like, so in terms of, like, because of the nerdy things that I was into, so, but on the flip side, I we're kind of addressing, like, bullying, and perhaps more in the next podcast addressing, like, bullying within nerd culture. There's two instances that I can think of where perhaps, like, I was the bully. One was when I was in fourth grade, like, school for the first year or whatever. Like, I was proud of my ability to draw, and there was another kid in the fourth grade class who was also, like, really good at drawing, but I didn't like his style of drawing. Like, he made stuff, but I personally didn't like it. And so, like, I guess at some point I had expressed that to him. And then 2 years later in 6th grade, like, he had another larger kid come up to me and be like, hey, like, he wants to talk to you about how you bullied him. And I was like, what? Like, and so, you know, I feel bad that that happened, but I was also kind of like a little confused because I didn't think that I had like been that discouraging to him. But I guess from my perspective, the little that I had said was had an effect on him. So, you know, it's like, I guess the term is like, you do you, and like, you know, that was on me for poo-pooing his efforts in something that we were both interested in. But I like viewed myself as like, quote unquote, superior at. And then there was another instance that wasn't so much bullying, but also kind of on this note of like, bullying within the nerd community happens usually by people who view themselves as like more knowledgeable. There was one time, like my freshman year of college, where we were talking about some nerdy thing. I don't remember exactly what it was. It might have been related to comic books, you know, with the kind of proliferation of like the Marvel Cinematic Universe and other things like that. But someone was talking about something, and I got really fired up, and I didn't think of this as bullying, but they expressed an opinion that I viewed as wrong, because, you know, canonically wrong with something or whatever, and I got really fired up about it. And I didn't bully them, and like, we were still like friends after that and everything. Like, it was this single instance of me being like, no, like, that is like incorrect. But that was kind of me being like, you know, and I don't know if that's bullying, and that I felt like I had more information than they did. And I didn't tell them that, like, I guess I didn't tell them like they were incapable or like they weren't a true fan or something, but I was like, I pointed out what was wrong. And I wish I had I wish I could remember more specifics of that, but anyways, that's kind of like what I thought of when this topic was brought up.
I agree with your assessment that might not have been bullying because you didn't put down their knowledge or their incorrect knowledge or their incorrect, you know, whatever opinion of the subject. But when you mention that, it does bring to mind times where, you know, we'll get on this again, as we will thousands of times, about Star Wars, where someone has said like, oh, I love Star Wars, and I've sort of like caught myself saying like, oh yeah, like, what about, you know, this one really specific instance in like the now extended universe that happened, and you don't know about this thing, and sort of catching myself saying that and being like, wow, you're being a dick about this. Like, you need to chill. Like, not everyone is willing to go to the lengths that you are willing to go, like, to learn about Star Wars. Like, go see the movie, have a good time, say you like Star Wars. Like, that's fine, you know. And I'm like catching myself now, like trying to sort of not be where you were and get myself like kind of fired up about this thing to a lot of people that they, you know, they either don't care or it's not a big deal to them, and that's fine. You know, if you like what you like and you don't like what you don't like, and that's your choice.
Do you like Star Wars? Do you really like Star Wars?
That's kind of the question it becomes for me with when I meet new people. It's like I have to gauge their interest.
Well, it's the kind of thing that people have been making jokes about for years. There's a famous Foxtrot comic that involves one of the characters who's a Star Wars and Star Trek fan, and his sister can't tell the difference between them, and he makes a lot of jokes about that. But the joke is on him often. And there's questions in comedy always of punching up versus punching down, and it's hard to tell sometimes in those jokes which one is which direction is up and which direction is down, and it can get a little uncomfortable there. But that same kind of thing comes up. And then you have things like there's a meme that goes around periodically. And there's various examples of it. The one that's coming to mind is a picture of Patrick Stewart.
Yes.
And it has a quote on it that says, "Use the Force, Harry, Gandalf." And then underneath it, there's a caption that says, "Here, this will drive all the nerds crazy."
Because you're taking, let's say 1, 2,
Star Trek,
3,
Star Wars, Harry Potter, and Lord of the Rings.
Yeah,
you're applying them all incorrectly.
You're taking 4 fandoms and smashing them together in order to bring about sort of the angry chaos.
It's the most ambitious crossover event.
Well, and that's the thing, is that then you get the fan fiction writers who immediately take one look at that and go, ooh.
Fan fiction is
its own branch
is the rabbit hole.
Oh yeah.
So I really don't even want to poke my head in there because we will get.
That's a perfect. But I'm just gonna. All I want to say, Joe, is just it's a perfectly valid rabbit hole and it's a perfectly valid expression of fandom. When you talk about
absolutely.
When you talk about the lengths that people go to, one of the things that amuses me that I pointed out on the thread you were talking about is that it's also about which lengths are considered valid, because when you say, oh, well, what about this thing from the extended universe that only appears in the guide to such and such a novel that was said in such and such an interview, there's a privilege there about what kind of lengths are considered okay that tend to be practiced by what groups, because it would be considered extremely odd to see a fandom in which, well, how many erotic fan fictions have you written about Obi-Wan Kenobi? Was a measure that most people would take as accurate.
I will proudly interject to say 0, but also Kuyer Arlet Nixar Picasso. I will go to that length to learn, teach myself, write, read, and speak Mandalorian. And not a lot of people will go to that length because they will see it as a waste of their time, even if they are considering themselves diehard Star Wars nerds. And that's it. And I sort of want to close this bit of the topic on, it doesn't matter how much of a nerd you are. Like, if you are into something that is nerdy, whether it be fantasy, sci-fi, movies, comics, video games, whatever, if you are into something nerdy and I would say we'll draw the line here, and the line is gray and it's broad, but for the sake of argument and for the sake of this conversation moving forward, so we don't always have to jump back to this, I'll put the line in the sand right here, and I'll say that we will, for the purposes of this discussion, consider you a nerd if you have extended knowledge about something. So let's say Jacob watched all of the Harry Potter movies and he knows all of the events that take place in the movies. But he also knows about this one extra thing that was maybe in a deleted scene, or they interviewed J.K. Rowling and she mentioned this. And so he has that extra knowledge. I would say, for the purposes of this discussion and the discussion moving forward, that is what, in this example, makes Jacob a Harry Potter nerd. Is he knows that little bit of extra information, whether it's a little or a ton.
I would also, it's kind of ending the topic, at least for this part of the discussion or this episode or whatever. I would agree that, or like defining nerddom as someone being a higher quality of nerd or being more or less of a nerd on something that's a good way to be divisive, and that's what a lot of people like pride themselves on. And it's, I think it's like just like being human, like that's a thing, is that we like to compare ourselves with other people, even if it makes everyone sad sometimes. But when it comes to like nerddom, I think it's more kind of a measure of like personal identification with something, and like your own personal fervor about something. So like there's plenty of people who have seen all 7 Harry Potter films, but you would not refer to them as nerds or Potterheads or whatever. Like they've seen all the movies, maybe they even like them, but like, like if you find them having like maybe not a heated but like an excited conversation with someone about like, oh, like remember this part and like that was so cool, and like, if they are like personally invested, I think, and maybe that's maybe the like the metric we should use. If someone is personally invested in something to a point where like they in like and not to be like, oh, some people, like you're like someone who really enjoys this and you're someone who doesn't really enjoy this, but like, there's plenty of people who've like seen, I don't know, like for instance, I know tons of people who love Dragon Ball Z, like love it, like it was their childhood, and you like could say that they're like a nerd about like Dragon Ball, like they're part of that fandom and they love it, but like they don't like anime in general, but they really like Dragon Ball Z. And so it's like, it's, I think it's just kind of like, yeah, it's being a nerd is more
personal involvement more than extra knowledge.
Yeah, I have to say, I think the subculture definition is a really good one. Do you identify in this as part of your culture? Is this something that is your home? Is this
I'm actually gonna have to go with that on 2 votes to 1 here. Is that I feel like makes a lot more sense than the direction I was trying to steer us in. But
yeah.
I appreciate that that will bring interesting food for thought for next time. And this, as it turns out, is probably going to be broken up into more than a couple episodes. But it will be an ongoing topic. We don't want to bring it up every week because I feel like it will just make us all sad and weary about.
Look, some of this stuff will definitely make you lose faith in humanity fast.
Yes. So with that kind of definition that we have from Jacob and Irina, I think we're going to call it a cut for the day, and this will be sort of the topic of bullying in nerd culture will be an ongoing discussion. And next time, in the coming weeks, we will have some more information for you. And in the meantime, in between time, like I said, give us some links, some stuff you definitely want us to talk about. It's things we should bring up, things we should address, things we should maybe discuss. What is your definition of a nerd? Like, what makes you a nerd and this person not a nerd? Or what makes this person a nerd and this person sort of more or less of a nerd? Let us know what you think, for sure. Leave us a comment on either our YouTube or our Facebook page. Facebook we will check more regularly. But definitely leave us a comment and give us some feedback. Let us know what you think.
Yep.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, no, it was great to have
you,
and we will invite you back for sure.
I would love to come back,
especially about this topic, because you have
an elevated perspective.
Yes, I would say
I haven't had an experience with it.
Yes.
So.
As we've seen sort of already come up. But this has been the Dr. Z Show. I'm Tony.
I'm Jacob.
I'm Marina.
And we will see you guys next time. Thank you.
Adios.
Wale.